We'll stay on this story. Delighted to say we are joined from the Lebanese capital by Michel Helou. He's the Secretary General of the Lebanese National Bloc, the leader of one of the coalition parties in the Lebanese parliament. Thank you very much indeed, Michel, for coming on the programme. Well, you'll have heard some of what Randolph had to say, and you'll know it very well yourself. I mean, how do you assess the situation across the country, nearly a week into this ceasefire agreement?
Look, as much as it is a relief for many Lebanese, the fact that the fighting stopped and that many of our fellow Lebanese can go back home, as much as the ceasefire remains extremely fragile, because from the onset, there are two agreements, not one. There's the official one signed by Lebanon, Israel, the US, the UN, and France. And then there's a side agreement that is signed only between Israel and the United States. And in both agreements, the demands of both fighting parties, Israel and Hezbollah, do not match. So the official agreement cannot be considered, unfortunately, as serious, or the general package cannot be considered as serious and a solid commitment. Because on the one hand, you have Israel that wants to get rid of Hezbollah entirely, and that is ready to violate the agreement as it has violated, hundreds of agreements before, as much as they want in order to reach their goal. And on the other hand, you have Hezbollah that wants to keep its weapon and to keep its presence in the south, and this cannot work either. It is also some sort of a violation of the agreement. So this is a let's say situation which we can very hardly exit from, and which is a very unstable situation in the middle. And the real important question is, what benefits the Lebanese state and the Lebanese people? What does benefit us? And what we need is very simple, is one, to allow people to come back home and to rebuild. And for that, we need to make sure that the Israelis withdraw completely from the land, because they're still occupying close to 60 villages with a curfew. They're preventing people from leaving their homes. And we need them to stop violating our airspace and land and water, let's say, territory. Yeah. But we also need to make sure that we end the half-century rule of militias in our country. And the only solution for that is to make sure that Hezbollah clearly hands its weapons to the Lebanese state, and that Lebanese states become finally the only decision maker in this arena, the only decision maker on a political and on a military and on a security dimension. This is what we need as Lebanese.
Well, it's a big ambition, but it's also one that's hard to see how that would come into fruition anytime soon, because as you've just been saying, Hezbollah is deeply entwined in the fabric of Lebanon. It takes part in the parliament and has members of parliament and government. So really the Lebanese people here are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Now, how much support does Hezbollah continue to enjoy across the country, given what's happened in the past year and particularly the past 2 months?
It is clear that Hezbollah is intertwined and is as much as it is a military organization created by the Iranians in the 1980s, it is also a very strong social, political, even educational organization. So it still enjoys a pretty strong support, specifically from the Shia community. And recently, with the disasters that we've gone through, with the mass destruction done by the Israelis on our land and to our country, well, definitely many people have sided with Hezbollah against the Israelis. However, I think that first, outside of the Shia community, the very large majority of people stand firmly against Hezbollah, not because they side with Israel, as many people accuse them to do, just because they've seen what Hezbollah has done to our country over the last 40 years, and specifically over the last 20 years, when Hezbollah was the strongest political and military force in the country. However, even in the Shia community, we also see, more and more opposition to Hezbollah, simply because people do not believe anymore in a theocratic party they do not believe anymore, and a party that take its orders from Iran directly instead of taking their orders from the Lebanese people, of a party that opens fronts. They have opened the war in 2006, they have opened the war in 2023, and miscalculated every time. And this miscalculation has cost us close to the equivalent of our GDP in terms of losses.
Yeah, and Lebanon was already a country with an economic crisis before all of this began. Most specifically, right now, in the short term, it's important for the Lebanese people that this ceasefire holds. And part of that is that the Lebanese army, along with UN peacekeepers, will try to ensure security in the south. How big a challenge is that?
This is clearly a major challenge. The first challenge is much more than being military or a security challenge. It is a political challenge, in a sense that the army needs political support in order to execute the orders. And from that perspective, what we need is a large and wide consensus across sects, across political parties in Lebanon that will say, okay, we've been trying what they called resistance, or non-state actors such as Hezbollah, in order to remain as a force against Israel, but we don't really know if it's a pro-Iranian or an anti-Israeli force, or a social organization, etc. So we've tried it. The reality is it didn't work. So now is the time that all of us sit down together and think, okay, guys, how do we really protect our land, and how do we make sure that our country is stable for the coming years? Not just that we end this war and that we end it properly, but also that we make sure that this war is the last one. This would require very strong political consensus, among, as I said, most political parties, from the ruling class, also from the opposition, from the reformists, which we belong to, and then a decision, diplomatic decision, to make sure that Hezbollah ends up handing its weapons to the Lebanese state, so the Lebanese state can properly negotiate with the United States, with the United Nations, with France, in order to make sure that Israel leaves our country and respects our sovereignty.
It's a huge ambition, it's a huge challenge, but Michel, we wish you all the best, and thank you very much for joining us on the News Hour. Michel Helou, they're leader of one of the coalition parties in Lebanon.